Well, the first half of the narrative has dramatically painted the problem for us, and we see the negative aspects to Jacob's character. We understand his conniving heart. What we don't yet see is how God is going to fix him, how God is going to bring about some significant change in that conniving character. The second half of the narrative will deal with that. It's going to show God intervening in some pretty dramatic ways in order to grab his attention and to point him in the direction he needs to go. And he will use Jacob's words against him in order to accomplish God's purposes in Jacob's life. In the first half of the narrative of Jacob, we saw the oracle of promise. We saw how God was at work even through the corruption and the attempt at manipulation that we see with Jacob and Rebekah. We see God at work, and he is the one who's bringing the promise. And so in chapter 28, he interrupts Jacob's peaceful slumber to tell him that he has a plan for his life. And yet, Jacob is still struggling with all of this. When he gets to Haran, what we're going to see in the second half of the narrative is that God has indeed been at work. In chapters 29 and 30, we see that God is prospering Jacob with wives, with children, with flocks. And even though there's tremendous conflict in the family because of all that has happened here, we see that God is at work behind the scenes. And what Jacob is going to have to learn is to relax and to submit to God at work and find God's blessing God's way, not his own way. Leah, his primary wife, is going to have 4 sons, and it's instructive as we hear her voice as she has children. Clearly, she's not loved. Hated is the opposite, of course. When the Lord saw Leah was hated, probably in the fact of in relationship to Rachel. He opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. She conceived, and she said, because the Lord has looked upon my affliction, for now my husband will love me. Now, the fact that he opened her womb, perhaps she was barren. We don't know for sure. Rachel certainly is. She conceived again and bore a son, because the Lord has heard that I am hated. She named him Simeon. She conceived again and bore a son. Now this time my husband will be attached to me because I've borne him 3 sons. So she calls him Levi. And she gives one more son. This time I will praise Yahweh. I'll praise the Lord. Therefore she called his name Judah. And what we see clearly in her words is that it is God's blessing. God is at work here. Of course, her rival Rachel can't have kids, so she gives Jacob her maidservant. We've seen that before. And again, it turns out not so well, but Dan and Naphtali are born from Bilhah. Leah gives him her servant, and Gad and Asher are born from Zilpah. Then Leah has 2 more because God is at work. And then finally, Rachel bears Joseph. And we see, once again, that the barren wife has born a child that's going to be a child of promise. By the way, I do want you to remember these 4 that are on the screen. So Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah are going to become very significant in the narrative that will follow. And so you need to remember these names and the order of the first 4, not the rest, but at least these 4. Now, as I mentioned already, God is at work here. And in fact, Rachel is barren. So that helps us to see that God is specifically at work in the child that will be born here, because this is another child that is miraculous and a child of promise, which will be, of course, Joseph. The emphasis, of course, in these chapters, as we look at the birth of the children, as we read already of much of the words of Leah, is that God is the one giving blessing. God is the one who opens the womb. God is the one who sees. God is the one who gives. God is the one who remembers. And so they are consciously, at least, recognizing that this is God's blessing upon them. That's really the emphasis. God is at work. And remember, this is the promise that God has made to Jacob. He's going to give him descendants, and he is fulfilling his promise. This is God at work. We also recognize in the words of Jacob himself that this is God at work. And so when he turns to his wives and he realizes that Laban's favor is really no longer to him and that he needs to get out of Dodge, and in fact, God comes to him and says, you need to go, and reminds him of his vow to God that he would go back and he would worship him, he goes to his wives and he reminds them that this is God at work. Let's take a look at chapter 31. First of all, Jacob saw, he hears what Jacob's sons are saying in verse 1, and in verse 2, he saw that Laban did not regard him with favors before. But the Lord comes to him and says, return to the land of your fathers and to your kindred, and I will be with you. Now those are intended to remind him of the promise that he got back in chapter 28. So Jacob calls his wives and he says to them, and he actually calls them into the field where nobody can hear, I think. And then in verse 5 he says, I see your father doesn't regard me with favors he did before, but the God of my father's been with me. You know how I've served him with all my strength, yet your father has cheated me and changed my wages 10 times. This is the first we've heard about it, but Laban will not object when he says it later. But God did not permit him to harm me. Notice that. Laban tries to cheat me, but God did not permit him to harm me. And then he walks through this, but notice how he sees the outcome of it. Verse 9, God has taken away the livestock of your father and given them to me. So he recognizes that God has been at work. He reminds them that God has, or he tells them that God has appeared to him in a dream, and he reminds them of the vow that he made at Bethel. And in fact, the first time this is reported, God doesn't, or the narrator doesn't tell us that God reminds him of the vow, but in this case, he tells his wives that God has reminded him of the vow. Look at verse 13. I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar and made a vow to me. Now rise, go out of this land and return to the land of your kindred. What's the implication? You better keep your vow. So he recognizes that God is at work. He understands that God has kept his end of the bargain. God has been with him. God has protected him even from old Whitey. And God has reminded him now that he needs to go back and he needs to do what he has promised. Now the promise was, if you recall, he's going to go back to that place. He's going to worship God. He's going to give him a tenth, and he will, Yahweh will be his God. So that's where he needs to go. And now he is ready to head out. When he does, when he leaves, Laban hears about it. Now it's 3 days before Laban hears about it, so he gathers up his people. He is not a happy camper, and he chases after Jacob. Now it is quite a ways, but he catches him. He goes across the Euphrates, he crosses all the way down into Canaan, and just as Jacob is getting ready to cross into the land God has promised him, cross the Jordan, Laban catches up to him. And as Laban is about to catch him, God appears to Laban in a dream in verse 24. God came to Laban the Aramean in a dream by night and said to him, be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. And Laban then overtakes Jacob. What has God done? Laban, keep your hands off. He is mine. So Laban comes to him and he berates Jacob and he says, why did you do this? Why did you trick me? And etc., etc. And I could have hurt you, but God said no, verse 29. So why did you do this, and why did you steal my gods? Now this is news to Jacob. He didn't know that Rachel had taken her father's household gods. There's debate as to what's going on here. Perhaps she is assuming this is the inheritance, or perhaps she is attached to them in terms of worship. And both of those are problems because neither one is recognizing God's care for him. But what Jacob notices, and really what the narrator is trying to show us, that it is indeed God keeping his word. God is doing exactly what he has said. God has protected him supernaturally. It's out of Jacob's hands, but God is keeping his promise to him. That protective promise includes not only keeping them in spite of the foolishness of the wives, but in spite of the foolishness of Jacob. He didn't have to run. God is on his side. He didn't have to try to do it secretly. God is on his side. But he's really not yet trusting God in this, is he? God has also continued to bless him. We see that clearly as we see the response of these men. They make a covenant. They swear that they will not either hurt the other, and He states in verse 42, first of all, God saw my affliction, the labor of my hands. He rebuked you last night. And he says, all of this, Laban says, all of this is mine. But we see that God has taken this and God has given it, if you will, to Jacob. So they make the agreement. They set up a heap of stones and they swear to each other that they're not going to harm each other. They're not going to hurt each other. Excuse me. So God is the judge, verse 53. So Jacob swore by the fear of his father Isaac. And Jacob makes another oath that he is going to indeed honor this covenant. What we see then is God is blessing, God is working, God is keeping his word. The question will be, will Jacob keep his word? As soon as they cross over the river here, they're not yet into Canaan, they haven't crossed the Jordan, but they're crossing into the place where they're going to cross the river Peniel, if you remember that on your maps. He's met again by angels. If you remember, leaving the land in chapter 30 or chapter 28, he's met by angels. As he comes back into the land, he's met by angels again. When he was met by angels the first time, God said, I will protect you, I will keep you. He's met by angels again. You would think that that would show him that God is indeed protecting him, just as he's already seen from Laban. And in fact, Jacob's response is, oh, this is God's camp. It's thinking this is his military camp. He's got his angels out here. He's got the army here, so to speak. And so he names the place two camps. The initial implication seems to be, oh, there's a camp for God and there's a camp for me. But the implication for Jacob immediately is he's got to recognize God is protecting him. That's really significant for what's about to follow, because the question becomes, how much will Jacob trust God, and how much is he going to trust himself? This place, this picture, it seems to be the place where Jacob is. This is the Peniel River, or the Peniel, sorry, the place is called Peniel, but it's the Jabbok River, and Peniel is looking east and Peniel's in front of you. Excuse me, it is the hill. And what we see here is the working of God in this fascinating narrative. Let me just walk through the narrative with you. First of all, he sends a messenger down to Esau to say, hey, I'm home. The messenger comes back and says, oh yeah, we found him and we talked to him and he's coming to meet you, along with about 400 men. And the question becomes, well, why on earth would he bring 400 men if he just wants to come and say hi? Jacob probably rightly assumes he's coming to carry out his threat. Don't know for sure, but that's what it would appear. He is greatly afraid. He divides up his people into two camps, which is ironic given what he's just said about two camps. The initial statement is, oh, it's God's protection. This statement is, oh, I've got to figure out a way to survive myself. And Jacob prays to the Lord. And his prayer is good. His prayer is, hey, I'm not worthy of the least of the deeds of steadfast love and all the faithfulness you've shown to your servant. For only with my staff I crossed this Jordan, and now I've become two camps. Please deliver me from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him. Who should he fear? Interestingly, if you move back to chapter 31, verse 53, he swears to Laban by the fear of his father Isaac. That's Yahweh. But he says, I fear Esau, and it's true, he does. You said, I will surely do good to you, make your offspring as the sand of the sea, which can't be numbered for multitude. In other words, God, you have made this promise to me, please keep it. On the other hand, he is thinking, but just in case, and he starts dividing up his goods, and he sends across he sends ahead of him this great present to Esau to sort of ease the way, to grease the skids, and make sure that Esau will accept him favorably. In fact, that's exactly what he says in verse 20. When they get to Esau, they should say to him, moreover, your servant Jacob's behind us, for he thought, I may appease him with a present that goes ahead of me, and afterward I shall see his face. Perhaps he will accept me. So the present goes on ahead of him. He takes everybody, he sends them across the river, he's left alone. And when he's left alone by the side of this river, a man meets him. Now the initial impression is, who is this guy that meets him? And I think he thinks that this is indeed Esau, that Esau has come to kill him. but in actuality, it's God. Now, if we turn over to Hosea chapter 12, we see that it's an angel of God, but it's God in one way or another. It's God represented by this angel, and the angel is God's work in his life. And we see him wrestling with the angel. And again, I'd like to just read through the passage a bit. Verse 24. Jacob was left alone. A man wrestled with him until breaking of the day. And when the man saw he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Now, I want to stop there for a second because I want you to think about this for a minute. He's wrestling with this, quote, man. We know that it's God, or it's an angel of God at least. Can he not overpower Jacob? Jacob is wrestling all night long, and he will not give up. So it's not so much that God can't overpower him physically, but it is that Jacob refuses to submit, refuses to bow. And when he finally touches his hip supernaturally so that he can no longer use his legs, well, he really can't wrestle, can he? And all he can do is cling. And the angel says to him, let me go, the day is broken. But Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. Somehow Jacob has finally realized that he can only cling and he can no longer wrestle. He's got to learn to stop fighting with God, to cling to God, and that's when he asks for blessing. And of course, that's when he gets blessing. What does the angel say? What is your name? Jacob. Interesting, isn't it? Because Jacob is a reminder of his character. God says, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have wrestled or striven with God and with men and have prevailed. Jacob said, well, who are you? What's your name? He said, why do you want my name? Probably because it's a means of manipulation. In their culture, in their context, they believed if they knew the name of the gods, they could use that to their advantage. And he refuses. He blesses him, however, and Jacob calls the name of the place Face of God, Peniel, for saying, I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered. He realizes that God has come to him. Now, we need to ask the question, why does God do this? Why wrestle with him all night? Why have this appearance of God, this theophany, where God comes and appears to him in the form of a man, or an angel of God comes and appears to him in the form of a man, and he is thinking it's Esau, and yet he realizes finally it's not, and we have this struggle. Why? I would like to suggest that this is symbolic, and God is using it as a picture for Jacob to understand something about his life. The name that he gives him, Israel, means either he fights with God or God fights. In giving him this name, he is reminding him of the fact that he has been struggling with God his whole life. God has given him promises from birth. But Jacob is not willing to allow God to give them. Jacob instead tries to wrestle them for himself. And what he has to see is that he cannot find blessing that way. He can only find blessing when he stops, allows God to fight for him, and clings to God, and finds God as his source of life. As a reminder of this, God gives him a permanent limp, a disability, if you will. And that disability, much like Paul's perhaps in 2 Corinthians 12, is to show that his power is perfected in our weakness. But the story's really not over. This is just a means. Notice what comes next. He has named this place the face of God. If you look at the Aaronic blessing, that means if you see the face of God, you see blessing. Those who are in relationship with him are going to find blessing. And we see the blessing immediately in chapter 33. Chapter 33, Jacob lifts up his eyes and there's Esau. Ooh, all of a sudden, the big man's coming and 400 men. So quick, 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 get your family divided up. And he puts them in groups. And of course, he goes from least favored to most favored. That's going to come back to bite him later. But notice what he does. He goes out in front of them all. He bows himself to the ground 7 times. And in verse 4, Esau ran to meet him and embraced him, fell on his neck, kissed, and they wept. Wait a minute. What happened to this intent of Esau? I don't know. Or do we? I think the narrator gives us a clue. Notice what happens. Esau lifts up his voice as he sees all the women and children. He says, who are these? And he says, Jacob says, oh, these are the ones that God has graciously given your servant. God has blessed me with them. And as they come by, he meets them all and he says, well, what's all that stuff that you sent to me? He says, to find favor in the sight of my Lord. He says, I have enough, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself. Jacob says, no, please. Notice this carefully. If I have found favor in your sight, accept my present from my hand. I've seen your face, which is like seeing the face of God, and you've accepted me. Please accept my blessing that is brought to you. Some of the translations say gift here or present here. He's been using a different word for present all the way along. All of a sudden he switches it to blessing. And he recognizes that as he has received blessing from God, he can now bestow blessing even on the brother from whom he stole blessing. But there's more. Look at verse 10. Once more, I have seen your face, which is like seeing the face of God, and you have accepted me. You have accepted me. What does he mean? Does he look at Esau and he says, hey, you look like that guy I wrestled last night? I don't think so. I don't think the point is he looks like the guy. The issue here is that Jacob has seen God at work. Just like he saw God at work in the angel last night, he sees God at work in the face of Esau. And because of that, and because he recognizes God is at work, the man who probably, though we don't know for sure, we have to infer, why would you take 400 men? Probably set out to destroy Jacob. Ends up reconciling with Jacob, falling on his neck and kissing him. Sounds kind of strange, but that's what he does. In their culture, what is he doing? Welcoming him with open arms. That's God at work. God has changed his heart. So therefore, Jacob gives him blessing. And what does he discover? God has been at work. God has fought for him. God has done exactly what God has promised. That does bring responsibility on Jacob, though, doesn't it? Jacob is responsible to do what Jacob has promised. But he doesn't. He doesn't go to Bethel. He goes to Shechem. This is a picture of Shechem as it is today. Off to the right, not in your picture actually, is the place where we have Jacob's well. It probably is the actual well. And this is the place that now has a church over it. But this is the place where he comes. Shechem itself is this brown mound in the middle of the city. That's the ancient tell of Shechem. And that is the place where they are going to meet the sons of Shechem, and they're going to have some challenges here, actually. When he comes to Shechem, it says that he erected an altar and he called it El Elohe Yisrael. He builds an altar to the Lord and he worships God. Yay, Jacob, right? Well, unfortunately, he's settling among the Canaanites. He did not fulfill his vow, nor is he fully worshiping. How do we know? Well, we'll see that in chapter 35. But in chapter 34, we see he settles down, he buys a field, he sends out his kids, and of course we know what happens here at this place. His daughter Dinah is raped. It's a long story that we don't have time to go into all the details. It's actually a very fascinating story. Not only the way it's told, but the implications of what he is trying to tell us here as he tells us. But basically, His daughter is raped. He does nothing. The sons come in from the field, and they are definitely struggling with this. They decide to use the covenant as a bargaining chip. And so they say, hey, if you guys will get circumcised, we'll all be one big happy family. The people at Shechem say it's a great deal because look how rich these people are. They get circumcised, and then Simeon and Levi go in and kill every male in Shechem with the edge of the sword. And it's at that point in verse 26 that we realize that they have not returned Dinah. So they have come in one sense, they've rescued her. In another sense, however, they have gone way overboard in killing all of the Shechemites, which is even contrary to what we see in the law later. She is not a married woman, so the law would say he needs to take care of her and he should marry her, but if he doesn't marry, he has to at least take care of her for the rest of her life. So their righteous indignation is carried out in unrighteous ways, and of course their father objects. He says, hey, you've made me stinky. He didn't say, oh, that was the wrong thing to do, nor is he taking care of it himself. He's concerned for his own skin. And their concern is, hey, should they treat our sister like a prostitute? Of course not. It's at this point God is going to appear to him again. God will now intervene again. He appears to Jacob again, and this time he says, get up, Jacob, go to Bethel and dwell there. Make an altar to the Lord who appeared to you when you fled from your brother Esau. In other words, fulfill your vow. Do what you've said. I've been telling you all along you need to go and you need to do this. Now Jacob is petrified, but not as afraid as all of the people around him. Look at verse 5. As they journeyed, a terror from God fell on the cities. What is God doing? He's protecting them. Notice something else, however. We've already alluded to this, already mentioned it, that Jacob isn't really worshiping God fully, nor is his family. Look at verse 2. So Jacob said to his household and all who were with him, put away the foreign gods among you and purify yourselves and change your garments. Wow. Jacob has known all along that they were not fully worshiping Yahweh, and yet he's been pretending to follow God. God, because of his promise, because of his oracles, is doing exactly what God has said. And he has been using these circumstances to work in Jacob's heart. And Jacob finally comes to the point of saying, I guess I have to stop wrestling and start clinging. And perhaps where it may have been only personal before, if it was personal at all, he finally says, hey, look, we've all got to serve Yahweh. And they all put away the foreign gods. That's exactly what he had promised, isn't it? You will be my God. So finally, he is fulfilling his promise, at least in part so far. So they journey, they go to Bethel, which is called Luz previously. It's now going to be called Bethel, or House of God. He builds an altar in verse 7, and he calls the place El Bethel, meaning God of the house of God, because their God had revealed himself to him when he fled from his brother. Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, dies. She's buried, and God appears to Jacob again when he came from Paddan Aram and blessed him. And God says to him, your name is Jacob. Wait a minute, I thought his name was Israel. Oh, coming back to that in just a moment. No longer shall your name be called Jacob, but Israel shall be your name. So he called his name Israel. And God said to him, I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall come from you, and kings shall come from your own body. The land I gave to Abram and Isaac I'll give to you, and I will give you the land to your offspring after you. And God went up from him in the place where he had spoken with him. He set up the pillar, he pours out a drink offering, and he calls the name of the place Bethel. He fulfills his vow. God names him Israel. Now, I have a question for you. Why? Hasn't he already named him Israel? Isn't that what the angel did as God's representative in chapter 32? Yes. So what's going on? Did you notice he's never called Israel between chapter 32 and chapter 35? He's just Jacob. Remember when we talked about the naming of Abraham, and we talked about how Abram would walk into the local sheets and say, hey, Interneshkol. They say, hey, Abram, and he says, hey, no, my name is Abraham. It's a sign of submission. He is owning God's authority over him. Jacob hasn't. He hasn't really submitted Now we will see him as Israel. Perfectly? No. We will see it back and forth, which I don't think there's a clear pattern, but I think there are reminders as we go back and forth between Jacob and Israel of Jacob's willfulness, of Jacob's character, and of Jacob's need to submit and that God will fight for him. So finally we have submission. Finally we have true worship. Finally we have Jacob keeping his promise. We also have the renewed blessing as God reminds him of the covenant, reminds him that he is going to give him the land and the seed, reminding him that God will keep his end of the deal and God is going to give them the fulfillment of the promises. The stories about Jacob now are basically ended. This is the end of the Jacob stories of the Toledot of Isaac. We have a brief genealogy at the end that explains to us the final things. But this is a reminder that God is at work in lives, and he is going to accomplish his purpose in spite of the foolishness of those who he chooses. And of course, he has to bring Jacob to the point where he can actually bless him, where he can actually use him.